Good evening. My name is Christopher Adams, and I'm the rector of St. Paul's College here at the University of Manitoba. I wish to start with noting that our college and the forks of the city of Winnipeg sit at the crossroads of the Anishinaabe, Métis, Cree, Dakota, and Oji Cree nations. The college acknowledges specifically that we are in Treaty 1 territory and on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe peoples and the homeland of the Métis Nation. I join with my colleagues at the Arthur V. Mauro Centre for Peace and Justice and the University of Manitoba in welcoming Dr. Celia Cook-Huffman. Welcome, Celia. Oh, there you are. Welcome. Who will be giving the 2015 St. Paul's College University Affiliation Lecture. An excellent choice to be our 2015 lecturer. We will hear a little more about Dr. Cook-Huffman in a few moments when she is introduced by her colleague, friend, and former classmate, Dr. Anna Snyder. This is the 8th year that the St. Paul's College University Affiliation Lecture has been given. This lecture series brings together faculty and students in the fields of peace and conflict studies and related disciplines to share ideas and to pursue relationships that further this field of study and research. The lecture series provides an open, public forum for ideas and conversation, and we welcome students, faculty, and members of the public who have joined us today. Please be advised that this event will be videotaped and a live webcast is going on right now. And before we go further, I want to express our deep gratitude for our sponsors and partners. We would like to thank Dr. Sean Byrne, Director of the Mauro Centre, for his leadership regarding this lecture series. We wish to thank Dr. Zeno Latvia, the newly installed Director of the Peace and Conflict Studies Program, for the continued support of the PACS program in furtherance of the lectureship series. And unfortunately, Zena is ill today and won't be able to join us. She's watching the webcast right now. We wish to acknowledge the efforts of the Peace and Conflict Studies Students Association, which is led by President Kendra Magnuson and the Education Committee Chair, Julie Hyde, for organizing tomorrow's graduate student roundtable, which will be taking place here in St. Paul's College. And we have a very strong contingent of PAC students. So say hello to each other up there, back there. Hello. We also acknowledge the ongoing funding support of Aikins Law for this lecture series. This local law firm, has been a longtime supporter of Mauro Centre activities and a founding sponsor of this lecture series. We are pleased that Tom Dooley, who is a partner with the firm and a longtime member of the Mauro Board of Directors, is here to moderate the question and answer session that will follow Celia's lecture to us this evening. Finally, I would like to recognize the continued support of the University of Manitoba for St. Paul's College, the Mauro Centre, and this lecture series. The newly launched University Strategic 5-year strategic plan calls us to forge connections that foster high-impact community engagement both locally and internationally. We know this lecture series and the graduate student roundtable to follow tomorrow will continue to build local and international relationships to help fulfill this goal now and in the future. So I would now like to call upon Susan Gotthal, the university's Vice Provost for Students, to bring greetings from the University of Manitoba.
Thanks, Chris. I told Chris a little while ago that I don't know how an institution actually brings greetings, bricks and mortar. But I am delighted to be here with you this evening and to represent colleagues at the university, and I actually see colleagues from the who I work with. From the university here tonight, and to bring a warm welcome to this year's speaker, Celia, and to our students, to faculty who are here, and all of the friends of St. Paul's College and the University of Manitoba. So welcome to this year's lecture series. I have to say that I am particularly interested in hearing Dr. Cook-Huffman. I think that she, both as a woman and a role model for what she's talking about and what she represents. I note that she's the first of 8 speakers in the series that is female, about time, I'd say, and I know that there are plenty of students out there who will certainly in the future follow in her footsteps. But as a women's historian, it really warms my heart particularly. Her research focuses on many things, but including the relationship between gender issues and conflict. I'm also interested because I co-chair a committee at the university on a presidential advisory committee on respect, and actually there is, I noticed another member of our committee sitting in the audience, and I was particularly intrigued that in the bio that Celia says that in exploring conflict, she asks her students to think about how to wage conflicts productively as well as how to resolve them. And if we can do that within our classrooms, if we can do that as colleagues, we certainly should learn how we can do that on a more global level in the world. So welcome and thank you very much for the collaboration.
Thank you, Susan. Thank you, Susan. I would now like to have Dr. Anna Snyder, who is an Associate Professor of Conflict Resolution Studies at Menno Simons College and an Adjunct Professor here at the Peace and Conflict Studies program at St. Paul's College, to provide an introduction to our 2015 St. Paul's College University Affiliation Lecture.
Hello. I am just delighted to welcome Dr. Celia Cook-Huffman to Winnipeg. Welcome, Celia. She made it here despite the weather and plane delays and so on, so really good to see her here. Dr. Celia Cook-Huffman is an educator, a training consultant, and also a dear friend of mine. She just said, and I quote, that she tries to make a difference in the world. And I'd like to tell you a little bit how she does that. She's a professor of peace and conflict studies at Juniata College, where she holds the W. Clay and Catherine Burkholder Professorship in Conflict Resolution. She's also the Associate Director of the Baker Institute for Peace and Conflict Studies. If that's not enough, she is also Director of Baker Mediation Services and Director of the newly launched MA program in Nonprofit Leadership. Celia, how do you do all that? Oh, okay. All right. Her background combines peace studies with specialized training and education in conflict transformation, nonviolence, gender, and mediation. Now, Dr. Cook-Huffman and I have been following each other around for years, although we have a slight difference in age. I won't say which it is. We have actually followed exactly the same educational path. So she has a BA in Peace and Conflict Studies from Manchester College, now Manchester University, where apparently we met. I guess as a graduate, as an alum, I sold her my refrigerator, which fortunately it worked, and we're still friends today. She is also a graduate of the MA program at University of Notre Dame in International Peace Studies, where I was also a graduate. And again, we both got our PhDs from Syracuse University and worked closely with the program on the analysis and resolution of conflict and Dr. Louis Kreisberg. So she's, we have followed the same paths. She's an outstanding teacher and has won a number of awards, particularly the Juniata Junior Faculty Distinguished Teaching Award and the Beachley Award for Distinguished Academic Service. She's taught courses at Transcend University with Johan Galtung and the Institute for Social and European Studies as well. Her research interests are about the impact of social identity on conflict, and we're going to be hearing more about that. But also the relationship between gender issues and conflict and nonviolent social change. And I have been particularly influenced by her work titled "Who Do They Say We Are? Framing Social Identity and Gender in Church Conflict," which looks at how aspects of identity shift in importance in intergroup conflict. And it's a really just a brilliant article, and one that we were just talking at dinner. We really haven't seen that much written on that particular area. Her most recent publications include Christianity and Nonviolence in Companion to Religion and Social Justice, edited by Michael Palmer, and The Role of Identity in Conflict in a Handbook of Conflict Analysis and Resolution by my colleagues here, edited in 2009. And so in addition to all this, Celia is also a trainer and consultant, and so has quite a history of practice, and in terms of training college faculty in change and integration management, meeting facilitation, and quite a bit of peer mediation, including in Cyprus, and training for the Alaskan Marine Highway biannual meeting, which sounds really, really interesting. Okay. So Celia, thank you very much for coming to speak to us, coming all the way to Winnipeg. You're very welcome.
So thank you, both for the warm welcome and the kind introduction. I should say I'll follow Anna anywhere, so it's even good to follow you up here on the podium. It also struck me as I was listening to that long line of titles, but maybe there's a reason I study identity, because maybe I'm just confused and I need to apply this to myself. At some point it starts to sound a little crazy. So again, let me just say thank you very much for the invitation to be with you this evening. It's really delightful to be here. As Anna alluded to, there were a couple of moments yesterday when I really didn't think I was going to make it because of the weather in Chicago, so I really am just incredibly appreciative to be here, to be part of your learning community. And to be part of the relationship building that, Chris, you were referring to in terms of the mission and purpose of the Mauro Centre. I'm delighted to be among folks from different walks of life who do different kinds of work. I hope that the comments that I have to talk about tonight in terms of identity, that there'll be a place that resonates with each of you as academics, as practitioners, as students, as community members, as folks thinking about how you engage with conflict in your lives. All right, so identity matters. When we think about social conflict and understanding the role of identities, I think is really just fundamentally important. And again, for those of you who know me, I'll put identity in any conflict that I come into contact with. I think for me, I have this huge bias that I think it's part of all of them. But I'll try to sort of back off from that just a little bit this evening. But I think if we take a cursory glance at the headlines, we'll notice that identity is really represented in all of the things that we're looking at out there in the world, whether it's conflicts. I'll talk a little bit about the U.S. tonight, and police community relations in Ferguson, in New York, in Cleveland. I noticed there was something in the news about Montreal, the rise of ISIS in the Middle East, the Ukraine, U.S. senators. I love U.S. senators deciding that they have more ability to speak on behalf of the U.S. and the president and the negotiation team to Iran. Elton John calling for a boycott of Dolce & Gabbana because of their stance on same-sex marriages, right? Identity is just this ubiquitous piece of what shows up when we think about conflict. And the intersection of identity and conflict is part and parcel, I think, of how we talk about and think about who we are in the world. When we look at identity in terms of its relationship to conflict, much of the research begins in earnest following World War II, and it's really driven in part by the tragedies and the devastation of the Holocaust. Academics really wanting to come to grips and understand, asking the questions, how did this happen? How do we think about working on issues of identity in a way that we might be able to give some credence and understanding, strength to the notion of we never want this to happen again, right? So what I want to do this evening is I want to explore the implications of how we think about identity for our work, both as conflict theorists and practitioners. I'm going to focus particularly on the role of social identity in intergroup conflict and collective action. Again, my hope is that my observations around these two particular areas of the intersection of identity and conflict will speak to those of you in the room who might come in at different levels of engagement and conflict, and that hopefully it will set us up for having good conversation after my formal comments. Identities matter because we can't function in the world without them. And I'm going to lose track of my slides. Sorry. We can't function in the world without them. We need them to make sense of ourselves. We need them to make sense of our world. We need to understand them so we know how to act and how to be in appropriate ways. We need them so that we can organize for social change. There's also what we might think of as the sort of dark side to identity. And Maloof refers to this in his book, In the Name of Identity. He talks about identity as treacherous, as a false friend, that we think that we know what it means and then it betrays us. When it becomes inflexible, so it becomes inflexible, it stops being adaptive, these things that should allow us to move and find our space in the world in different contexts and make sense of who we are no matter what roles we're playing, they have this danger, this dark side of becoming rigid and inflexible. They can become the space where there's only one that matters. It's the only way I can think about myself. It demands allegiance and total commitment and loyalty at any cost. And these monolithic identities, I'm going to argue, are a trap for those of us who live in them and for us as conflict theorists and practitioners. And I think that we have a special responsibility when we study conflict to avoid this particular trap of identity, the temptation to reify and to reproduce categories that are fixed, that are presented to us as fixed realities, authentic and I can never say this word. I can't say it. Skip that word. Authentic fixtures of the conflict. And instead, I'm going to argue that what we need to do is we need to reveal and explore how they are contingent, how they are constitutive forces that are shaped by context and reality, and in turn, give meaning and shape and form to our lives. So the plan, I'm going to give some definitions. I want to give us a framework for how we might do this work, how we might interrogate and sort of destabilize what often appear to be really fixed and rigid identities. A little theory. My academic hat, I can't not do the theory piece. I want to play with some examples, and then again, I hope that we have a conversation with one another. So let me start by just doing a quick definition of identity. When we talk about identity, when we use this term identity, what is it that we mean? Fundamentally, we often start with identity as a sense of self, right? We talk about who we are as people, as individuals. I'm a mom, I'm a teacher, I'm a daughter, member of the U.S., citizen of the U.S., right? And so in this most general way, we think about identity as a way of naming who people are and giving a sense of perhaps their place in the world. When theorists, when conflict analysts, practitioners out there in the world use identity, they use it as an analytic concept to refer to a really wide range of phenomena. Right? We use it to talk about things like collectives and nation states, ethnic groups, which are defined by shared experiences, geography, and history, perhaps ancestry. We use it to talk about religious groups connected by belief systems and values. We use it to name broad social categories like race and gender and class, as well as smaller systems like families or a team. And again, finally, as a way to talk about these sort of core aspects of ourselves. I'm a procrastinator, right? I need lots of sleep, those kinds of things. We also use it to talk about processes. Think identity talk, identity work, face-saving presentations, identity crisis, identity expression, identity politics. So we use it to engage and think about this really, really broad range of different kinds of concepts. And we also use it in this really interesting way, I think, to talk, again, both about flexible and adaptive, always moving and ever-shaping things. We want to use it to talk about these fluid ideas, right? We all have multiple identities that we can inhabit in any moment. And at the same time, we're often trying to use it to talk about something that's very fixed. Again, this notion that identities become rigid and monolithic. And so when I think particularly as practitioners and conflict theorists, we try to figure out, well, how do we name this thing, this entity, this idea, this concept, this place and space that people are living in that we want to be able to study or do research about. And I think, for me, this is a particular place where we really need to think really carefully about the work that we do. How is it that we can begin to talk about the ways that identities matter in conflict without necessarily participating in reifying, reproducing, contributing to a set of relationships that we may not want to be ongoing, right? That we don't want to necessarily just reinforce in our work. Sorry, I'm getting behind in my slides again. So the different ways that we use identity. So I think one of the first challenges that we have as conflict theorists, as practitioners in the field, is to think about how do we theorize a moving target? What Brubaker and Cooper call a permanence amidst change and unity amidst manifest diversity. And again, how do we do this without necessarily engaging in or reifying a particular identity and reinforcing, again, relationships that we don't want to reinforce? And I think the second thing we have to grapple with as conflict theorists and practitioners, how do we understand a phenomena that, again, is essential for humans? We need it to know who we are. It's a critical element of who we are in terms of how we engage in social change work. And yet again, it has this potential to be incredibly destructive and to maybe be the root of some of the most devastating kinds of conflicts that we've seen on campus. And so what I want to think about is how's the task, right, is how do we engage in explaining how particular categories come to be experienced as a common group identity, and when categorization processes lead to this crystallization of a particular identity. And the challenge for us is to theorize this without assuming what it is that we're talking about. So I think I'm going to argue that it's essential that we adopt an analytical frame that separates the process of identity making, identification, categorization, self-representations, communality, connectedness, from the outcome, right, a particular identity. If we want to understand the roles that identity plays in conflict, intractable, seemingly inevitable, impossible to resolve kinds of conflict successfully, and to ethically engage with identity in our resolution and transformation work, we need to understand how a particular identity comes to have the power and meaning that it does in a particular time and place. As analysts and practitioners, can we avoid the trap of reification in our work? Can we manage the dark side of we and harness the power of collective action that depends on a collective sense of self? So I'm going to inhabit my quintessential academic hat at this moment and say, maybe. Maybe. And so what I want to offer, in part for our conversation, is a framework for thinking about how we might do this. And it's a framework that's based off the work of a practitioner, a theorist called Stephen Riker, and this concept of what he calls entrepreneurs of identity. And the entrepreneurs of identity is a perceptual approach. And what it does is it names and captures the active process, the agency involved in building a collective identity, right? They aren't just givens. They don't just show up. They are made, often with a particular agenda in mind. And so in this framework, right, the way that we conceptualize and think about identity is to think about them as products and projects, right? If we're going to think about how do we handle this concept, right? How do we not make sure that we don't reify the categories that we're given, but also really want to understand how do they come to have meaning and purpose in particular conflicts? Then I think this notion of thinking of them as products and projects is a way that we can get our head around the concepts, do good analytical work, and also not just reproduce and reinforce relationships that may not be healthy or productive. All right. So I want to situate this framework within the context of social identity theory, which is the framework that it comes out of. And so I'm just going to try to briefly, see how I'm doing on my time, briefly talk a little bit about social identity theory, and then we'll circle back to some examples and think about what this looks like in practice. So social identity theory and social categorization theory, sorry, I'm going to grab my Our theories are approaches that want to explain the psychological aspects of intergroup conflict. And they're not trying to argue that psychological components are the only or the most significant always pieces of conflict, right, that they come into play with social and political forces as well. But it's a theory and approach that really wants to look at the psychological components that are present in conflict. And again, the theory primarily starts with the work of Henry Tajfel. who wanted to explore the source of intractable and deep-rooted conflicts, again, in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And so, briefly, social identity theory wants to understand when and how social identities interact and impact intergroup behavior. And there's lots of focus in the tradition on understanding the role of identity both within intragroup conflicts and intergroup conflicts. At its heart, though, it's a theory of social change. Again, Tajfel was particularly interested in the ways in which communities engage in and resist discrimination and injustice. How is it that communities are able to mobilize themselves for social change? Oh, sorry, I'm sorry, I'm way behind in my slides. So this notion of identity as projects and products. So social identity is that part of our sense of self that comes from our membership in groups, along with the values and emotional significance attached to that membership. How does the answer, who am I, become not just about my personality, I'm creative, I'm hardworking, I want to be funny, but it also incorporates a psychological sense of myself as a group, as members of different groups, right? So I'm female, I'm white, I'm American, I do yoga, I'm a college professor, I'm a mom, right? All of those things matter. I think my gender identity became very salient, as you were talking about, being the first woman to serve, to give this lecture. So social identity, right, is that part of our sense of self that comes from our membership in those groups and how those groups then inform our sense of self and our understanding of who we are in the world. And social identity theory argues a couple of things, right, that we always identify ourselves in terms of who we're not, right, in the same way that individuals understand who they are by who they're not. The same thing happens in terms of our group relationships, right? We understand who we are because we're not them. And it argues that the motivation to identify with a particular group is driven in part by a couple of things: the desire for positive distinctiveness and the desire for inclusion. So we want to become parts of group. It's important to our sense of self in terms of who we are, and we also want the groups that we are part of to reflect positively on who we are. Right? I want to have a positive sense of self because of my membership in particular groups. And the value that's associated with any particular group, of course, is context specific. It's contingent upon the broader social cultural context in which those identities exist, and it's contingent upon who we compare ourselves to. So on college campuses, right, sports matters. Yes? No? Maybe? So on your college campus, who's on top? No? So, okay, so on your campus, what are the hierarchies then? What are the groups that matter and who's on top? St. Paul's College members. All right, there you go. Anybody want to contest that? No? Who else? Who on your college campuses, what are the groups, who's on top? Student union. Okay, so that matters. People have a positive sense of self from being part of the student union. Maybe. Anybody else want to throw one out? Who else? What other groups, collectives matter on campus, give people a sense of self and identity? Tell me the hierarchy. Excellent. Engineering faculty. So who are the non-engineering students in the room? Anybody want to protest? Maybe? Okay. So the context matters, right? So at my college campus, right, athletics do help differentiate who are the top groups and who are the bottom groups. On my campus, actually, women's volleyball, right, is the group that's going to give you a lot of status. And football is pretty close to the bottom, although we did have a winning season last year, so it's sort of edging up in terms of its ability to give members who belong to it a positive sense of self. In this context, right, what identities are salient for me, being an academic, right, being a college professor, being asked to come in and try to say some wise things. In Huntington, where I live, right, I don't go around calling myself Dr. Cook-Huffman, right? I live in a context in which academics, education is probably going to be treated more with suspicion than it is with a sense of that's important, that's something that's going to get me credentials where I live. So context matters in terms of this notion of, we want to be members of a group, we want that group to have a positive reflection on who we are and our sense of self in the world, but the context is going to influence what groups give us that positive sense of self, and what attributes and what characteristics of that membership also matter, right? That's also going to fluctuate. So there are a couple of reasons that I find this theory really compelling and useful, right? Part of it is that it assumes that there are lots of potential identities out there, right? There are lots of potential identities. Variance is the rule. We might not have unlimited choices in terms of the groups that we identify with, but we have a lot of choices. And the theory understands that social identities are emergent, that they're context-specific, outcomes of individual interactions with their social environment. Again, if my kids came into the room and were screaming really loud and noisily, right, you probably would see my mom identity pop right outside the top of my head, right? If they come in and they're quiet and we don't notice them, I'm probably going to continue to be able to maintain much more my sense of who I am as an academic and a mom, rather than being a mom. The term that social identity theorists use to talk about this is salience, right? Salience is the idea about which identity matters in any particular given context, and a salient identity is the one that has acquired significance in a particular time and place, and therefore influences perceptions and behaviors. It tells us how we're supposed to be and how we're supposed to act in particular contexts, right? So how many of you, I don't know if I can do this one, but I'll try, right? How many of you would say, oh, I behave really differently with my friends, right, from my parents than when you're with Dr. Byrne in the classroom? Maybe not so much the last one, all right. But, right, the other ones, right? So we have this sense, right, that we, and part of what social identity theory wants us to really think about is the fact that those behaving one way in one context and a different way in another context is not somehow not being true to yourself, right? Because social identities matter, because they shape our sense of self, those differences of behavior are completely authentic for who we are in those different moments, right? We are being true to ourselves. We're being who we're supposed to be when we inhabit those categories, because those categories tell us about how we're supposed to behave. They give us guidance about how we're supposed to behave in the world. All right, so we have a world in which we have a lot of different potential identity categories. We can move around and inhabit them differently depending on the situation. So the question is, right, how do we get from this fluidity to, again, these fixed, rigid, monolithic identities that we can then use, right, I'm going to use that word, that we can then use to get people to do things they might not normally do otherwise, right? And we can preview here, right, but we can talk about that both in terms of good things in the world as well as perhaps destructive and negative things in the world. All right, I'm going to stay on top of my slides this time. So I have this lovely little model that I created for you. So what I want to think about then is run back to this notion of entrepreneurs of identity, right? If there are entrepreneurs of identity in the world, people who are mobilizing particular identities for particular purposes, right? Particular projects, and they're creating particular identity products. What is it that we need to understand about how that can happen in the world? So again, social identity theory has a lot to say about intergroup behavior, and I just want to tug on these 4 strands a little bit. Sorry, again, I have to keep track of my time. Okay. So the first strand is what happens when we identify with a particular group category, right? When we see ourselves as members, what happens? So one of the things that happens is this notion of depersonalization, right? That I stop thinking of myself as an individual and I think of myself as a group member. And again, this is not about a sense of identity loss, right? This is about a sense of inhabiting the identity that's appropriate as a member of that particular group. So when we inhabit this group, we have this process of depersonalization, right? We tend to see ourselves and other members of that same category less as individuals and more as exemplars of that particular group. We can think about this almost as a group prototype. Right? We know what it means to be a good academic. We know what it means to be a good mom, right? What's a good friend supposed to look like? So when you inhabit those categories, you want to then demonstrate the behaviors that are appropriate for the category that you're inhabiting. So once we adapt these sort of notions of prototypes, then a whole lot of other things come along with that. For example, Sorry, I have two examples going on. Let me do a different one. When we adopt this prototype notion, right, then these categories become essential attributes of who we're supposed to be. Again, let me just do the quick context comparison. So think about yourselves as Canadians, right? So when you think about yourself and Canadians in comparison to Americans, right? Okay, so what's a good Canadian look like in comparison to an American? Polite. What else? What's a good Canadian look like if you're compared to an American? I can take it. Humble. Okay, good, excellent. So those are the categories, right, that might be good Canadians in the face of American. Now, what if I compare you as Canadians to each other, let's say hockey teams? So if you're a good fan of the Jets, is that what you, all right, so then what's a good Jet fan supposed to do?
Cheer the Jets all the time.
Cheer the Jets all the time. And if you're in the room with someone who's not a Jets fan?
Well, he's with the bag.
All right? So again, a different sense of if you're a good Canadian and cheering for your team, right, it's going to look different than the attributes that might be the good Canadian attributes if you're comparing yourself to an American. Geography, right? Another way, if you think about what's a good mid Canadian, right, supposed to be in comparison, say, to a Quebecian or the other end. What's out there? Vancouver? Can we call them Vancouverians? I don't want to. Sorry if I'm like stepping on somebody's toes in a really bad way, right? So how do you know, right? You're from the middle, you're from the prairies. What does that mean? People use that word. Okay. Yeah. Diocese. What else, right? So if you're a prairie Canadian, how does that make you different than a East or West Coast Canadian? Are there prairie Canadian attributes? Climate. Okay, and what does it mean if you survive these harsh conditions? Yeah. So we know that he's a transplant. He comes from my part of Pennsylvania. I know. He's weak. He doesn't really understand these weather. Right? Are there things that go with surviving the weather?
Yeah, unique plumage.
Unique plumage? Nice.
Big skies.
Sorry?
Big skies.
Big skies, okay. And what does all of that say about who you are as Canadians? Again, is there a sense of what it means to be a Midwestern Canadian as opposed to coastal Canadians? You're nodding. Give me an attribute.
Well, just from the East Coast, genealogy plays a very important role in your identity,
Sure.
who you are, and your ties with the past. Less so anywhere else
Right.
in Canada. I mean,
Yes.
it's culturally unique to that part of Canada. Quebec, political activism, you don't find that here in the prairies. It's passive, it's more laid back. You figure out how to plow the streets eventually.
Yes. All right. Excellent. Okay. So thank you. So again, the comparison category, right, is going to have a significant influence. Again, I want to, even while these prototypes exist, they're also in and of themselves not static, right? The prototype of who you're supposed to be as a good Canadian is going to depend in part on who your comparison group is, right? But that prototype is still likely to kick in, right? If I say I'm going to put you in a room full of Americans, you're going to have a particular sense of inhabiting your Canadian identity in a very particular kind of way. So when we do that, right, so we have identification, right, we begin to, a whole other sets of things that happen once we see ourselves as members of that group. So intergroup accentuation, right, what does that mean? It means that once we identify with a group, we are likely to see, we minimize the differences between the members of our own group, and we maximize the differences with members of the outgroup. So we're likely to see ourselves as like the members of our group. We like the members of our group better, right? There's attributions and feelings that comes with belonging and participating with the group. So I'm more likely to like them. I think we share the same values. I think we share the same ideas, right? That we have this notion that we're just much more alike. There are often emotional connections, right, that come with this beyond just something liking the other people. We also tend to see them as more trustworthy. We see this really interesting research with pronouns, where if you ask people to just simply use the words we or you and I as opposed to them, right, it will trigger positive impressions of the people that you're referring to. We have better memories. We remember more easily the things that are the same about our in-group members. Right, again, so this perceptual bias that kicks in once we've identified with a particular group. And we also have a whole set of behavioral things that happen, right? So we're likely to be more helpful towards members of our own group. And when group identities are salient, we tend to be more trusting of our own members of our own group and less trusting of out-group members. So this intergroup accentuation happens. We also get into what is called in-group favoritism, right? And this is what Marilyn Brewer calls in-group love. Right, so the idea here is that once we've identified with an in-group, we also tend to be biased in favorism. We develop a sort of ethnocentrism about our in-group, right? And so we will discriminate in favor of them, right? If you have widgets to pass out, we'll give them more widgets. If we have money and things to share, we're more likely to share them with our in-group as opposed to out-group members. And this then can lead to a process of intergroup competition. Right? As groups seek positive distinctiveness for their own identities, we may do that by competing with out-groups. And so again, right, how are Canadians better than people from the US? Well, right, we may start that gently and kind of funny, right, but add a little tension, a little something we really care about, and that intergroup competition can increase pretty quickly and pretty easily. This gets us to out-group hate. Right? This notion that we move from being biased and having a sense of connection to and interest and favoritism for our own group, right, in-group love, to this notion that we might have competition and then become biased towards our out-group, and we begin to discriminate against them. Now, I think the critical finding, and that's really important as we think about this process from social identity theory, is that this is not automatic. Right? In-group love does not equal out-group hate. And so I think, again, when we think about this notion of entrepreneurs of identity, and how is it that we move from flexible, multiple possibilities of who we are in the world, that one of the things we need to be able to articulate is, how is it that we get from in-group love to out-group hate, right? It's not an automatic process. Work has to be done. And I'm not going to talk about all of these in particular for the sake of time, but again, there's a path by which we think we know how this happens, right? And there's a whole lot of things that contribute to it. We might think of this as fertile ground, right? Fertile ground for the entrepreneur of identity who's trying to mobilize a particular identity for a particular project. And as you can see towards the bottom, the psychological pieces certainly may coalesce with things like scarce resources, zero-sum games in terms of conflict, power politics that may make it more likely for this intergroup competition and outgroup discrimination or outgroup derogation to actually happen. And then just to circle quickly back, sorry, pointing my pointer in the wrong way, to this notion of mobilization, right? So we have this fertile ground. What we might think about is sort of the building blocks for an entrepreneur of identity. What else do they need then in terms of being able to sort of bring the project to culmination, if you will? And again, this is where the concept of depersonalization becomes really critical, that as we have this sense of depersonalization, this keen identification with a particular in-group, this notion of shared values and priorities, right, again, it leads to trust of in-group members, a desire to cooperate with and help in-group members, a sense of wanting to be in agreement with in-group members, right, all of which lays the groundwork for capacity then to be able to work together. And we develop a sense, again, of this notion of the group prototype. Those voices within the group that may have a lot of power in terms of being able to say, this is who we are, this is how we behave, this is who we should be, right? And this is how then we have entrepreneurs of identity who have to be able to be the ability to be persuasive about, look, this is what it means to be us, so here's what we need to go out and do in the world. And again, if we can use sort of the most maybe concrete and present example, think of Hitler, right? Hitler as the prototype of the Nazi movement, he becomes the movement. An attack on Hitler is an attack on the movement. So the more sort of coalesced folks become about the sort of nature of who we are as a group, the stronger a prototype exists, right? This is what it means to be us, the more capable then someone is of being able to encourage and support sort of mobilization of action around this particular identity category, right? So if these are the building blocks, right, if these are sort of the 4 processes of how we get to the building blocks of entrepreneurs of identity, we need identification with an in-group, this sort of notion of in-group love, right, might lead to the intergroup competition of out-group hate, and then this capacity for mobilization, right? What is it then that entrepreneurs of identity do? And essentially, what Stephen Riker argues is that there are 3 things that we need to have happen for the mobilization of this identity to really take place. So entrepreneurs of identity have to create boundaries, right? We have to decide who is us and who is them, who is not us. We have to create content. We have to create content. And part of that content is around what it means to be us. And we define the in-group as virtuous. So whatever we do is just and right. And we have to define the out-group as a threat. Thus, the violence that's done to them, or the ways that we treat them, the ways that we can behave to them, right, are also become a sense of self-defense and are justifiable. In addition, there are probably 2 other criteria when we think about the success of an entrepreneur of identity, right? So you have to have a boundary, who's in and who's out, this notion of the out-group as a threat and ourselves as virtuous. But because there are often also multiple competing versions of the identity, right? Again, we're trying to take this multiplicity and make it into something sort of rigid and fairly tight and concrete. To do this, you have to have not only the right version, but the natural version. Right? So the more able you are as an entrepreneur of identity to make your version look like the only version, and that's the word I want. This sort of natural version, right? It's just inevitable that this is really who we are, right? The more you're able to do that, the more legitimacy you're going to have as the spokesperson for who that group is, or for the entrepreneur of that group identity.
Right, like having the capital of human rights.
Sorry?
Being the capital of human rights.
Sure. Yeah, exactly, right. So you're sort of claiming this as this is inevitably who we are. This is an essentialist, right? As an essentialist conception of a particular group. Without it, we can't be who we are, right? And the more narrow and fixed and automatic and inevitable you can make that appear, the stronger then the sway you have in terms of being able to be the voice that mobilizes a particular group in terms of action. So let me talk a little bit about Rwanda as a specific case study. And again, as we get to questions and answers, I think we can, obviously, we'll have lots of different ways we might think about examples of this. So when we think about Rwanda, right, I think we can immediately begin to imagine and conceptualize that there are lots of different entrepreneurs of identity in different times of the history of the country. Pre-colonial kings, Germans, Belgians as colonizers, Hutu leaders of independence movements, power regimes at different points in post-colonial decades, exiles, and at present, right, the Kagame government. So under colonial rule, as the Germans and then the Belgians sought to build alliances with the already powerful Tutsi kings in the country, they invoked the Hamatic hypothesis. Right? The Hamatic hypothesis was this idea that those Africans who had more European features were descendants of Ham, the son of Noah, right? And so the Tutsi were identified as being more like Caucasian in terms of their features, and therefore, obviously, right, they were smarter, more capable, right, should be the ones who were in alliance with the Belgian colonizers. This obviously also then has its own self-serving narrative about the white man's burden and why the colonizers themselves, right, were the superior category and should be part of and should be in charge overall of the country. And they use these existing categories, if you can see up in the corner, right, this notion of the Tutsis, the Hutus, and the Twa. One of the things that I find really fascinating about the context of the Rwandan conflict is that we don't talk about the Twa almost ever, right? And so again, I think when we think about this notion of entrepreneurs of identity, not only do we want to think about who do we include, right? What categorizations become important in terms of identity, identifying who we are and who we aren't, but who's left out, right? Who's completely invisible? Who participates, in a sense, in this production of a particular identity product by their absence, right? And again, I think in this particular case, the Twa is a really interesting case or example of that. So let's just shift time periods a little bit again to think about in terms of this concept of entrepreneurs of identity. We have an example in the bottom right-hand corner, identity cards, right? This way in which the Belgians solidify this ethnic distinction, that they have created this narrative about why it's descended from time immemorial, that it's this clear ethnic distinction, that it can't be messed with, that these are these essential attributes that come with these categories, right? And again, they solidify it, legalize it in identity cards. As independence looms, right, we see the categories and the valences begin to shift. We have, in 1957, there's something called the Bahutu Manifesto, which was created by the Belgians and nine Hutu members of the Hutu elite at that time in history. And it's this point in history when the Belgians are shifting allegiance, right? So they've decided that as independence is looming, they want to align themselves with the majority population, which is the Hutu population. And so they begin to redefine the categories, right? So suddenly, these Ethiopian descent attribute that was the justification for why the Tutsis should be in charge and in control now has become a deficit. Right? Now it's a definition of why they're outsiders and why they don't really belong and why they shouldn't be allowed to be in governance in the country. The former oppressed field workers are now presented as hardworking, diligent, and loyal. Right? The attributes of being laborers has now been recast as a strength, again, instead of as a detriment. In post-independence Rwanda, we see again a shift in terms of how these categories and the valences are being used to describe what's going on in the country. So as there are contests for power within the Hutu majority itself, and different leaders are vying to take over control of the Hutu leadership, we have the Hutu Manifesto, which is created here as part of the Hutu power movement, and that's this document that's here on the left, the 10 points. And again, we see this as a way of particularly shifting and pushing hard on who the Tutsis are, right? So it works at creating the boundaries more clearly and more rigidly. The threat of the outgroup is heightened. There's this interesting, when we talk about intergroup conflict, we often talk about the ways in which outgroups are dehumanized. But there's often also this phenomena of how they are sort of superhumanized. They become the superhuman categories. And in particular, we see this happening with Tutsi women. So in this cartoon, these are two Tutsi women who are seducing General Duvalier, who was the head of the UN mission at this point in time, right? And so again, you get this notion of these are dangerous women, they're seductive, and you have to watch out for them. They're incredibly treacherous. And again, I would argue that part of the reason women are singled out so in such profound ways is part of this in-group, out-group identity project is that because there was so much intermarriage in Rwanda at the time, right? And so there's a lot of work that has to be done to continue to create the notion that these are two separate ethnic categories. They speak the same language, they've intermarried, they live in close community with one another. So how is it that this, again, if we think about the entrepreneurs of identity, how is it that they do this work of creating these two divergent communities in this context where you're hard-pressed in some ways to find the distinctions and the differences that result in, that are created so rigidly and so profoundly that they result in genocide, right? All right. I want to shift. Well, let me say a little bit more about this this notion of contingency again, right? That we have to present it as non-contingent. Again, the power of the entrepreneur of identity, the success for the entrepreneur of identity is when they have the ability to present an identity as if it's non-contingent, as if it's self-evident, as if it's the only version of among many, right? The only possible version. And entrepreneurs of identity will use lots and lots of pieces of the landscape, if you will, history, narrative, song, memory, symbols, national icons, all of the ways in which we construct an authentic category in order to sell it as the only possible version among many. Again, think about this in terms of sort of the purpose, right? If you're really successful and you're really good at being an entrepreneur of identity, then what you've managed to do is hide all the work that you do to create that identity, right? The more invisible you can make the work, the more successful, in a sense, you are as an entrepreneur of identity. And again, for me, this gets back to the caution and the ways that we need to think about ourselves as practitioners and as academics, right? That our job is to make that work visible. I think if we're going to do ethical work, we have to make that work visible. I want to just to flip this a little bit, because I think that this is one of the important things that we have to think about when we talk about the work of identity and conflict. The same process, right, that we use to mobilize hate, if you will, is the same process that we can use to mobilize any kind of collective action. And so this is the cover of a book, The Fragility of Goodness, written by Zetan Todorov, where he talks about how the Bulgarian Jews were saved in Nazi Germany. And Riker does an analysis of what happened and the kinds of language that we see the Bulgarians using to save their Jews. And in fact, it's the same process, right? It's the same process that an entrepreneur of what we might call the entrepreneur of hate uses, right? It's the same language that what we might call the entrepreneur of solidarity, right, uses. And so in this particular case, the boundaries, right, are there. Who's in and who's out. In the case of the Bulgarians, they defined the Jews as part of the in-group community, right? These are our Jews. They're Bulgarians. They're a religious minority, but they're Bulgarians. When you think about the ways in which they constructed the in-group virtues, they used virtues that allowed them to protect their national minority. So Bulgarians are tolerant, right? They're tolerant of religious minorities, but Bulgarians protect the weak. Right? So their virtues were virtues that allowed them to take care of this subgroup within their community. And the outgroup was constructed as a threat, right? But the threat was the Nazis or those who wanted to have the Jews be deported. So I think one of the things that we really want to think about, and we can think about this as we circle back to Rwanda as well, right? Here we have this really fascinating and interesting example. I can make that go away. At a national level, and I think we can talk about this. I think there's some concerns certainly about this notion of we are all Rwandans. But we have this very interesting identity project, right, that Kagame has undertaken at the government level to create this overarching identity of inclusion, right, as a way to do a recategorization process, as a way to try to create reconciliation opportunities within the country, and as a way to break down the overwhelmingly polarizing identities that existed and were fundamental to the genocide. I think there are implications for this notion as well for our work as practitioners and conflict theorists. And so I want to end by just sort of thinking a little bit about what happens if we think about ourselves as entrepreneurs of identity. Right? When are we, in our work as practitioners or conflict theorists, entrepreneurs of identity? And again, how is it when we think about how we might frame identity, both in terms of how we choose to do analysis, how we might identify the parties to a conflict, if we're doing reconciliation work, what frames, what identity categories do we offer to the parties, how inclusive or exclusive are they, what boundaries are we creating in the work and the ways that we might present a sense of who it is and how we're going to ask groups to engage with one another and talk to one another. And when we talk about this, particularly in relationship to conflict resolution and reconciliation work, right, social identity theory argues that when we think about creating those broad inclusive categories, there are sort of 3, maybe 4 ways that we can do that. One is recategorization, and this is the notion that we might create superordinate identities that include and incorporate the sub-identities in them. The dual identity model over in the corner, right, suggests that we might want to create or make salient superordinate identities that allow the subgroup identities to still remain strong. And then the cross-cutting ties model is a model that says what we really want to do is we allow the subgroup identities to go ahead and exist and coexist, but to try to create opportunities for those group members to interact and know one another in lots and lots of different contexts, so that the salience, the variability, becomes the norm as we move in and out of our relationships with one another. And again, there's lots of really interesting work that looks at, in particular contexts, which of these models might make the most sense. In what ways, when is recategorization categorization a really good idea. And again, there's lots and lots of research that suggests, yes, having groups come together in a broadly inclusive category, it kicks in all that positive in-group love, right? Piece of what we understand happens when we identify with a group, that can really ease intergroup tensions. There are also ways, though, in which it might undermine groups' desire or willingness to work for social change. And there are some cases in which, particularly where you have really differences in terms of majority-minority groups, that it may actually exacerbate the conflict. And so in those cases, right, the dual identity model has been shown to be a much stronger model in terms of how we might think about working at social change efforts. And again, I'll just use a quick example from the US to think about this. If we're going to use overarching categories to think about what we do with our work in reconciliation around race issues, and Ferguson in particular, right? How do we invoke frames that are overarching categories? Do we use things like Americans, citizens, neighbors, community members, right? What's the right overarching category? What attributes is it going to bring with it? Who is it going to include and who is it going to exclude? When we think about naming the particular parties, again, I think being really purposeful and thoughtful about the identity categories that we ourselves bring to the work is important. Police, safety, security, threat, protector, defender, murderer. What valences are we making salient by the ways in which we might position categories in relationship to one another? African Americans, victims, thugs, outsiders, activists, rioters, citizens, friend, foe, ally, right? The frames that we offer are going to create borders and boundaries, and we contribute in the ways that we construct these identities in relationship to one another. We contribute to the content, if you will, that fills them up. And so again, I think if we can think about ourselves as entrepreneurs of identity, again, to think very carefully and purposefully about what identity categories do we want to use for what purposes, what's our project, and what product are we trying to create in the work that we do. Identity matters, right? It's an essential part of how we know and understand ourselves and the world around us. It gives a sense of home, of belonging, and of safety. Identities matter in conflict because they provide the lattice work and the scaffolding that can become a false friend. But the danger is not in the identity per se. I think that if we can approach identities as projects, if we look for and uncover the role of a particular identity in a particular context, we can perhaps subvert the inevitability and incontrovertibility of particular divisions and create the potential for a shift. And again, I'm going to come back to Maloof in my closing. Right? It's often the way that we look at people that imprisons them. And we have some agency here. We have some capability for thinking about how we might shift the gaze and look at them in ways that might set them free or freer. So thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cook-Huffman. I'm now going to invite Mr. Tom Dooley from the Aikins Law Firm, or the major sponsor of this affiliation lecture, to lead us in the question and answer. Tom?
Tom told me that there's a hockey game at 9, and so I understand the parameters of which we're working.
Thank you, Christopher. I'm not sure that I'm going to be doing all that much leading, but our program calls this a Q&A period. Given Dr. Cook-Huffman's comments earlier, I think she called this a conversation. So we'll treat it as a conversation. And at the risk of being an entrepreneur of identities, because identity does matter, I would ask that when you are recognized to pose a question to Dr. Cook-Huffman, would you please identify yourself? Whether you're a student in the PACS program, or whether you're a member of the faculty, or whether you're a member of the community. Just from a social point of view, to give context to this conversation that's about to occur. I would ask that you limit yourself, once you've been recognized, to initiating one conversation with Dr. Cook-Huffman. If there's time later, you have another matter that you'd like to raise with her, perhaps you'll have an opportunity to do so. And just one final comment, and that is that we're here this evening to hear from Dr. Cook-Huffman, so any points of clarification or other areas that you'd like her to explore. So I'm going to ask you to come back here. I'm going to go over here, and I will just recognize people.
We also have a...
Do we have a portable mic?
you do. Oh,
No.
well, do you
Okay.
want...
Do we have one
Yes.
for the audience?
There's
So-
that one's back there.
Okay, that would be great. First question? Come on, somebody break the ice. Yes? This is being recorded, so if you
Yeah.
can use the mic, please.
My name is James Hoshin. I'm a member of the community. I went to St. Paul's. But how does God factor into all of this? And I'm being pretty open there, but I thought when you were speaking that the more we separate from God, the more conflict arises. At least that's my philosophy. And a lot of these conflicts that you mentioned might be a result of that. I'm just looking at my notes here. I think that's, I'll leave it at that for you to try to decipher.
Sure. No, I can start there. So I'm probably going to start in a different place than you did, and I'll see if I can circle back around. So I would actually argue I think that God is profound in these conversations, but I'm not sure in the way that you're meaning. So I think, again, if part of what, if I'm going to use this term right, the entrepreneurs of identity want to do is make their project look inevitable and natural, then to be able to invoke religious justification, right, to be a child of God, to be... Right. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, but so I sort of start there. I'm going to try to circle back around to where I think that you started with the question, right? So I think, for me, I think that God is often prevalent in this, in the sense of how people invoke and use both religious symbolism and religious meaning to justify the in-group and why the in-group is better than the out-group, right? And if God is on our side, again, if we think about that notion of making the in-group virtuous, right? If God is on our side, there's not much more virtue you can get than having God on your side. Having said all that, I think, again, for me, it's this notion of entrepreneurs of identity, right? So how do we want to use spirituality in terms of how we think about our lives? And we have these broad sort of narratives about individualism, about the individual nature of spirituality. For me, again, I'll come from the U.S., right? The sort of notion of the Protestant work ethic, right? All of those ways of being, I would argue, are attached to particular identities and sense of place in the world. So I think there are two ways we might think about this, right? So I think that when we want to talk about where's that sense of my relationship, if I have a relationship with God, right, how might that influence my behaviors, right? So one part of that is to de-individuate, right, as opposed to depersonalize, but to de-individuate, to not think of myself as members of a group, but to think of myself as an individual. How might that then inform my choices and behaviors? Can I use that as a wedge, as a way to evaluate, do I really want to be part of that group? If that group has this particular set of attributes and identity, do I want to inhabit that group with those people? Or do I not want to inhabit that group because I don't share those values? And can we use that sense of who we are as a way to sort of pull ourselves back to think about and evaluate what it might mean to choose to be a member? I also think, to some degree, we don't always have a choice about which identity categories we inhabit, right? Some of them, again, we're going to get some agency questions in here, but if someone wants to treat me as a woman, I may have a very hard time resisting, right, the implications of what that means and the expectations for my behavior. If someone wants to treat you as an outsider, depending on where you come from, right, those things can be very hard to resist. And I think the same is true in terms of this question about the individual sort of versus the collective. We need to belong. We need to be members of groups. I don't think we can live as islands. So there's always that tension then, I think, about my own personal values. What might they say about my behavior versus the pull to participate in and be a good prototypical member of Group X? I don't know if that answers your question well, but...
Other questions?
I'll jump in. Is this on?
Doesn't sound like.
Maybe I'll just... Okay, well, I'll try this anyway. On the slide, you had you used the reference to reconciliation at one point. I'm wondering if you could speak to that. We in Canada, going through the Truth and Reconciliation period on the residential schools, talked about Rwanda. There has to be reconciliation there, as well as South Africa, et cetera, et cetera. So if you could speak to that, that'd be great.
Well, let me start, pull it back again into relationship to the pieces that I'm talking about here, and then see if there's someplace else that you wanted to go with it. For me, again, I think they're just such interesting questions about first of all, what does reconciliation mean, right? Who are we doing it for? And who gets to name, again, if we're going to go back to my sort of notion of product and projects, right? Who gets to name both the projects, right? So what's the right way to do reconciliation, and what's the right product? How will we know if we have been reconciled? And again, I just think there are lots of tensions and questions around that when we think about those projects, right, of reconciliation. Some people are included, some people are excluded. Some voices get to name what that process should look like. Other people are excluded from naming that process. I think there are real differences in reconciliation in terms of what I might need as an individual versus what my community might need. And again, we're back into that then, that notion of what is the category, what is the salient identity need? And is that the same or different than the individual? For some folks, it's not gonna be different, right? If my group is better, I'm going to be better. For some people, it's not going to work that way, right? I'm going to have my own individual needs around that that are going to be important. And then I think we have state and national questions, right? So what does it mean for reconciliation to occur at the state level? And those things are not the same. And I think sometimes they're in deep tension. So a story from South Africa. An amazing truth and reconciliation process, by many standards successful in certain kinds of ways. There's I'm going to totally space his name, Brendan Hamburger, thanks, he's at NCORE, so I knew Sean would know. So Brendan Hamburger, right, who's like a psychologist who works on the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, he tells a story about a woman whose son was murdered, and she goes to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission because she wants to know what happened to my son. And what she learns is that her son was killed by his friends, not by South African white forces, but by his friends, because they thought he was a traitor. And so her son is killed. She spends a couple of years feeding, housing, clothing, hiding his murderers, who were his friends, and this is the truth that she learns at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So much more trauma. I mean, it doesn't heal her at all, right? It re-traumatizes, it adds new levels of trauma to what she's doing. So I think just a quick example of the tensions that exist as we try to think about reconciliation. I don't think there's a process that's going to be what every person needs, every individual needs. So I think we have to think about it conceptually in terms of what do individuals need, what do individuals need, what do those collective and groups need, right? If I'm being represented in part by my constituents, what are those needs? And then what's the sort of state level need, both in terms, I think, of responsibility, but healing at that collective level as well, I think, is important, right? If we have that overarching shared identity, which I think most of us do, right, then we need it at that level as well.
Any questions? Yes, please identify yourself and share your question.
Hello, I'm a student here. My name is Sherry Boudreau. I'm doing PhD. My other identity is I'm First Nations from British Columbia, the other coast. And yeah, I'm from that context. I guess I'm wondering about your work in terms of the concept of identity and teachings and learnings. So. The connection to identity, I was wondering, how do you switch out the word culture with respect to identity here? And so I'm wondering at the fundamental nature of, say, being born in a desert versus being born in, how's it, which is the rainiest place on earth. You know, that sets up, an understanding of sort of survivorship, and so I would say an aspect of culture, and therefore a differentiation of how you view the world. So does your research link that differentiation and that how do we cross that fundamental nature of how we've learned to be to how we learn to be with each other?
Okay, so there's a couple of really great questions in there. So for me, again, I think the notion that identity is it is completely constitutive, right? So it's part of who we are. It's defined by that culture, that world in which we live, right? So my sense about, I'll just use your example, right? Your sense about survivability, right, is going to look really different if I grew up in a desert versus if I grew up where it's incredibly cold, versus if I grew up where there's an abundance of food, where there's not an abundance of food, or if survivability for me is about safety and community and family, right? If I grew up in a family where there's no safety, right, my sense of survivability is going to be completely different than a place which might have a strong community support around certain levels of survivability, food and collectiveness, but you know, the threat in a sense is from nature or elements that are kind of outside our control. So absolutely, right, all of those things are going to make a difference in terms of how we inhabit, what the meaning of those particular identities, how we inhabit them, and I think also then how we use them, right, in terms of our own sense of place and belonging in the world. So that back and forth between culture and identity, I think, is constant. And again, it shifts over time, right? Even just do something maybe straightforward like gender, right? So what it meant to be a woman, again, we can do time and place, right? A woman on the prairies. There's a lovely book out there that talks about, that documents women who went across the U.S. prairies on covered wagons, right? And it's just these astonishing stories about what that means and what that looks like. But so for women on the prairies, right, your sense of who you are and what it means to be a woman, very different than if you're, living in New York City, and very different than if you're living in New York City today versus if you lived in New York City, in the early 19th century. So they're constantly shifting and being renegotiated, if you will, in the context of time and place. And for me, I think it's I would love some pushback on this and see how other people think about it. But for me, it's that notion that we tend to talk about and think about identities as if they're non-negotiables, and yet we negotiate them constantly. Right? They're in constant dialogue and in constant negotiation. So I don't know why, when we're practitioners and theorists, why we talk about and think about them as if they're non-negotiables. So it's that piece that I want to, and again, I think it has to do with that nature of trying to hold on to this intangible long enough to think about it and talk about it and do something with it, right? That's a challenge in and of itself. So, but I think it's that notion of negotiability, right, that's really critical and important. And I have now talked myself out of the second part of your question. Oh, how do we talk about those with each other? That was the second part of your question. Yes, all right, that's just a really good question. Time, effort, listening, translators. I think sometimes those conversations need someone who can help interpret, people who can serve as a bridge between one community and another. I don't know that it always can be direct. If I haven't lived your experience, there are pieces of it that I'm going to miss. I think there are questions about how much of that we need in order to inhabit each other's space enough to have empathy. I don't know that I need to have your experience to have empathy for your experience, but I need to have something, right, that allows me to connect you. And then again, if I can go back to my theoretical point, I think there's a lot of theorizing and work that we might do around this notion of that inclusive identity, right? So if we can invoke an identity that we both share, is that going to be a foothold into empathy for then learning to know not only how we are the same, but how we're different and valuing those differences, right? So, sorry. When we think about this model, right, one of the ways in which it might work, right, is think about this as a school system, right? So if the overarching identity is the school system, right, there's lots of space then in that for people to have differences that are equally valued. If we think about that as a family, right, that may be more problematic, right? If we're a family, you having some fundamentally different subgroups may threaten me, right, in terms of how I think what family should look like, or there are other models that we can use, right? So again, I think part of the theoretical question for me is there an overarching identity that we could find for whatever the conflict or point of difference might be that would facilitate that sense of sharedness enough so that I can really appreciate your differences?
Please identify yourself and push away.
Hello? Yeah. Oh. Yeah, I'm Jeffrey Fessick. I work in the Louis Riel school system with children. I really appreciate the work you've done in pushing it into the level of academia, and yeah. I'm seeing some of the questions asked, and I'm thinking, like, you talked about being the entrepreneur of identity. I've had more success being like more of a customer of identity, a customer of like God, and so you, as a customer, you can sample. I mean, I'm, baptized in the name of Jesus Christ, apostolic, but I can, spend time with the people of Manitou and sample a smudge, or, pray to Yahweh with a yarmulke, and, with respect in my identity. So, like, just keep on the down low being a customer rather than a type of, Hitler or something.
Yeah. No, so I love metaphors, and so I appreciate you I appreciate you working with and playing into the metaphor of that notion, right? If we're entrepreneurs of identity, then who gets to be, obviously we need some customers, right? Because we don't want everybody can't be the entrepreneur. That's just gonna make me mad, right? If you're trying to mess with my plan and my project, right? So yes, I think absolutely, right? We need customers. We need people who want to participate, who want to just sort of come along, right? And again, I also appreciate your articulation of that notion of here's an identity that you're experiencing that really is more that sort of entrepreneur of solidarity. And again, I think to that notion that we have to pull out that in-group love does not automatically trigger out-group hate, and that we can use that, right, to think about how do we become entrepreneurs of solidarity? How do we create those space in our identity for appreciation and inclusion and those kinds of things, right? So if my overarching core value of my identity is inclusion and tolerance, and I'm going to react differently to intergroup faith contexts than if my overarching identity is one of good and evil or righteous and sinner. Oh, so it's so interesting, right? I don't really often sort of conceptualize myself as a U.S. citizen, but I know, right? Like that's an identity that's really salient when you're the one in the room, or I'll pull a couple others in with me. But when yes, absolutely, I become a representative, whether I want to be or not, right? I am a representative. It's an identity I am inhabiting, regardless of my choice, in a certain way. Yeah, nice, thanks.
Other questions or comments?
Eduardo Soto. I am a student here in the PhD of Peace and Conflict Studies, and also a Jesuit priest. How to relate identity and power? Because I think that power is very important, because it's very different to belong to a group that is powerless than to belong to a group that have the power and also access to resources. And the second question is, you talk a lot about belonging, and I'm deeply interested in that area. But I want to ask you about, as the possibility of the overarching identity in order to resolve the conflict or to find reconciliation, what about the legitimate exclusions? Like exclusions, like groups that can legitimately exclude others. That is a possibility also through identity, when identity matters so much.
So give me an example of what you mean by a group that legitimately excludes.
Well, for example, families.
Oh, yeah, sure.
Or you have a family, this is your family, you belong to a neighborhood, but you have your family, and the issues that you have in your family are different than the other families.
Yeah.
So how relate that with identity and also with the overarching identity?
Sure. So again, I think that I'll use Marilyn Brewer's concept, right, of in-group love versus out-group hate, right? So we can have lots of identities where you're not me, and I think you're interesting, right? Or I think you're fascinating, maybe I think you're exotic, maybe I think you're fun. I don't want to be you, but I might want to hang out with you, right? And there's curiosity as opposed to animosity or threat. And so that's always possible. Well, okay, that may be an overstatement, but I think it's often possible. not go too far down that road of making proclamations, right? But I think it's often possible that, right, that those identities can coexist. And again, the difference is appreciated. I don't need you to be me. I'm happy for us to be different. I'm curious about you. That's great, right? So I think that's not a problem, right, in that sense. When you talk about the power differences, right, again, so social identity theory, Tajfel really wanted to understand this ability of groups to mobilize for social change. And for him, right, it's about identity. If you don't have a collective sense of self, you can't take collective action, right? And I think he's right? I think he's right. Again, this idea, right? We mobilize for change when we have a shared sense of self. That's how we act as groups, in concert as groups, is because we share that purpose, that meaning, that sense of who we are. So again, for me, it's this tension between, yeah, you can use that, I'm gonna use big terms here, right, for good or for evil. Right? And so that question for me of teasing out, what's the path that leads us down that entrepreneur of hate versus that entrepreneur of solidarity? What are how do we trace that path from in-group love to out-group hate? What are the factors that contribute to those two differences? And then again, conflict theorists and practitioners, if we're interested in changing that, how do we disrupt that path? How long before the hockey game starts? I can answer it partly too, right? So here in this model, when we look at the reconciliation work, there's really interesting research in terms of power differences and what people care about, right? So if you have minority-majority groups, high-power, low-power groups, not surprisingly, high-power groups are really interested in getting together and having really great talks about stuff we have in common. Right? Let's get together and talk about things we like. And then high-power groups, we feel better. I was so nice, to that little mind. We had a good time, and now, oh my gosh, their food is so good, and they cook such great things, and I had no idea, you could do that with, pick whatever, right? So high-power groups like to get together and talk about commonalities. Low-power groups, not surprisingly, often want to get together and talk about power and structural inequality. So there's some challenges here in terms of how we think about doing this work, right? Here's a really interesting piece. Low power groups also want to talk about commonalities. And the theorizing there is that it's because we also, I'll use gender, right? Like we also want to belong, right? So we'd like to see ourselves as part of that high power group, right? That makes us feel good. And some of the research on intergroup contact shows that when you do that, what happens is the subgroup solidarity goes down, and so people actually stop working for social change. Right? So there's a real danger to this process, perhaps, if what we're working at is social change, right? Because it can actually disempower low power groups even more to not participate in social change. So I'll try to really quickly say the response to that then is to try to to shift the content of what you talk about and to figure out how do you create, how does this identity, right? What you have to do is create this part of the identity has to both be willing to have a story in it that says our power is not legitimate, right? If you can say, okay, whatever goodies we got, really we shouldn't have. If that's present in that overarching identity, then both groups will be willing to talk about power, right? And both groups are more likely to work for social change. That makes sense. Yeah.
Sandra. Celia. Celia, thank you very much. I'd like to call Sandra Cron, who's a PhD student here in the Peace and Conflict Studies, to come and bring some words of appreciation for Dr. Cook-Huffman. Thanks, Sandra.
Thank you. On behalf of the
students at the Mauro Centre for Peace and Justice. I'd like to thank you so much for sharing with us today. And I was supposed to respond to your talk, and there's so many different threads in my mind that I'm kind of trying to pull together, and I'm very grateful that you're staying tomorrow so that we can have a discussion, further discussion on that. But one of the things I loved about even just the title kind of hooked me, this identity matters, because often we don't think about our identity. We live with it every day. We go into different settings and we change, because we know there's different things expected in different settings, but we don't often really think and articulate what that means to us. And often, though, in conflict, we start to, those things start to get highlighted. And both in practice, in peace and conflict, we deal with that, but right now I've been doing a lot of writing and looking at Canadian history and identity and even the history of my family. There's a lot of conflicting groups that are coming together. So sometimes it's really difficult to kind of put this stuff on paper and categorize people. So thank you very much. I have a lot of reading, I think, that I'd like to continue doing just from some of the ideas that you gave us today. And I would just like to give you this gift, and it'll help you remember us. Thank you. No, thank you very much. Thanks.
Thank you, Sandra. So just to finish up, thank you for being here, everybody, for this evening. I also, I'm not going to go through the acknowledgements again. I think we all know the appreciation we show for our sponsors, et cetera, in the university. I didn't mention Jason Brennan, who's been working very hard over the past number of months on getting this to be successfully done, and the fruits of his labor are here today, so thanks, Jason, for that. I'd like to thank Dr. Cook-Huffman for leading us with this great discussion. It's been a great evening. And I'd like to invite all of you to join us just out in the foyer, or as the Americans say, foyer, in the foyer for light refreshments outside. So thanks very much. Good night.